With us today, with me today, I have Alysse Soll, and she's been gracious enough with her time to agree to sit down for an interview, really, or a conversation about the role that research plays in her career and has played in her career. And I'm going to let her introduce herself in a minute, but just as an overview, right? Alysse was with the San Jose Sharks for 3 years in the 90s. She was with the National Hockey League for 13 years, transitioned into sort of a media track with Time Warner, and then since looks like since about the mid 2000s, she's been on a tear with a bunch of different startups and entrepreneurial type endeavors. So thank you for joining us today. I would like to turn it over to you now and just if you could provide a little bit more detailed background about your career and experiences, that would be wonderful.
Sure, thank you. And thank you for inviting me to be a part of this, education. I'm always going back to take classes because you don't know what you don't know. And I'm thrilled to have the opportunity to be here. Just to kind of tag on to what you said, I spent the first 17 years of my career in professional sports at the NHL. And during that time, I focused first on growth, which was launching 10 new NHL teams in 10 new NHL markets over the course of 10 years. So we were building our North American and global footprint. Later in my NHL tenure, I focused on marketing, which was really driving the NHL towards digital engagement. And then when I finished my NHL career, which was in about 2007, I then, to your point, focused on digital media and advertising technology with what was then Time Warner, which is now doesn't really exist. And about 5 years ago, I started working with tech startups and launched my consulting firm, which is NewModel Advisory. And in that role, we're focused on connecting sports properties with technologies that essentially solve for their pain points. In my role today, I advise sports tech startups on how to perfect their tech, their business model, their go-to-market roadmaps, their strategic partnerships, and of course with their capital fundraisers, because in this era, a lot of sports tech companies that are totally dependent upon sports cannot generate sales, but they need a runway to be able to pay for all of their, product roadmaps, so they go directly into fundraise. Kind of as a balance of all of this, I'm also an investor as a sports sector lead at the Harvard Business School Alumni Angels Group. I source technologies to bring to them, see if they want to invest. And I'm also a board member of WIST, which is Women in Sports Tech, where we elevate the engagement of women and members of the BIPOC community in sports tech roles. So that's kind of a quick overview about me.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Thank you. So lots and lots of themes in there related to, growing into new markets. I did not know that you launched 10 teams in 10 years. That's incredible. And so my first question is fairly straightforward, right? This is a research methods class, and as we've talked about, it's my goal to illustrate that, research is not just something that happens, by scientists in white coats in the lab somewhere. Research is what fuels business decisions every single day, right? Countless times. And so I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about the role and the importance of research, both within in the context of like the NHL, which is a large organization, and in the world of startups, right? So where does research fit into both of those structures?
So that's a really good question, and I'm going to make the statement right up front that research, or due diligence, as they say on the investor side, is absolutely key to a successful product and a successful investment. So if you're looking at it as an investor, whether you're an angel or a VC, the easiest way to think about it is that an investor invests in a business based on three core tenets: the jockey, which is the founder; the horse, which is the product; and the track, which is the total addressable market, or the TAM. And an investor is always looking for the ROI on the future valuation of the company. So they're making educated bets that the promise of the jockey, the horse, and the track are going to materialize. So if that research is all focused on due diligence, what a startup has to do is they have to show proof of concept. So literally, have you piloted your product with the target market, and what are the results of that pilot? And the feedback that you get from your pilots basically is in the form of insights and data, which is analytics that help you perfect, iterate, or pivot your product. So this feedback loop is really a critical benchmark, both for the perfection of your product and a benchmark for investors. But before you even get to proof of concept, you really need to truly understand your target market, your product's competitive landscape, and your execution. If you haven't thoroughly researched these areas to determine that there truly is a need for your product or your tech, you're kind of wasting your time. So the concept of research is understand where the pain point is, understand the solve that you're delivering, and is there really a need? To get to that level, you need to do all of these research steps first to make sure you actually have something that is viable and needed.
That's a really great overview. Just as a probing question, have you worked with or have you advised startups or companies maybe that shall remain anonymous that made some assumptions that were not backed by by data or by sound research, and if so, how did that impact the outcome, right, of their deliverable, of their solve, as you called it?
Yes, and it's a good question, because you find very often that a founder, okay, I always want to know the founder's story. I want to understand why they think that an idea or the ideation is going to work. So along the road, I'm introduced to very early stage companies who have this, there's an ideator, they've come up with an idea, they think it's going to work, and they kind of, put all of this together. And then when they get to me, just as an example, there was one company that was very focused on consumer technology for sports and fan engagement. And what they came to me with was something that actually was ahead of its time. And what the research that they hadn't done was they had this great technology and this great product, but they didn't understand that sports properties were not prepared to adopt their product. So what they had to do was literally re-engineer the product so that it was something that could easily be used by a sports property. Had they not done that, would have spent all of their time focused on this technology that had like 3 steps to go before a sports property could literally engage with it. So it's really understanding who your target market is, and are they educated enough to understand what you're doing? And do they really need you at this point in time? And I find that a lot of very early stage companies believe that their product is perfect, but they don't, and it could be, but it's also a matter of timing. If they are too early and their technology can't be adopted quickly enough, easily enough, seamlessly enough, without friction, and it's intuitive, then that's going to fail. Well, I'm not going to say it's going to fail, but it doesn't have as much of a chance of success versus this is where the marketplace is, this is where the pain is, and they deliver, and it's an overlap.
Perfect. Yeah, that's a really great example, and actually something you said is sort of prompting just one other follow-up. you mentioned that it's, I think founders and researchers, even in academia, are kind of prone to thinking that their technology or their research product that they're putting out there is infallible, and it becomes kind of like, this is my baby, right? And so how could it have flaws or technical things that need improvement? So have you seen those types of biases come to the table and impact how people make business decisions, right, in the absence of a sound research process?
Yes, and that's why I go back to those three core tenets. The jockey, who's the founder, right? The founder has to be flexible enough to understand that there is a potential for their technology, for their product, but they don't know what they don't know, which is why research helps them understand, if they're open-minded enough, about where they fit in the landscape, or they bring on consultants, or connect with people who have a broader purview about where their product market fit is. If you have a founder who is inflexible, it's very difficult to get them to the finish line. And it is very difficult to say to somebody, your baby's ugly. It doesn't mean your baby won't thrive. It just means you have to do more than put lipstick on a pig. You really have to understand the core value of what you're delivering, and you have to, as a founder, be flexible enough to iterate in a way that you're going to deliver a really good market fit. And that happens often. But the way that it's been my experience, that if a founder is flexible enough to understand they don't know what they don't know, and that you're helping them move forward, then you're going to have a positive experience. If they know more than anybody else, it's a real problem.
Understood. Yeah, great extension of my my baby analogy or metaphor there. So that brings us back to my my next question, which is, after doing all this work with the NHL and with the startups that you've worked with, what are some of the leading trends that you studied in the sports and entertainment space, and specifically how have those been modified or disrupted by the challenges we're facing right now in the midst of a pandemic / recession?
So, just as an overview, for sports, COVID-19's basically become the mother of necessity. Their old business model, with its dependence on live events, has had to literally pivot through the world of technology to retain consumer interest, to supplement revenues, and honestly, to keep athletes in top form. When you look at the world of sports compared to other verticals, sports have been a laggard in digital transformation. And that's really because professional leagues rely on the same business model that they've used for decades because it's worked. Their revenues really come from 4 core buckets: rights holders, those huge TV deals and digital rights holders deals, sponsorship, ticket sales, and merchandise. And there's other areas where they generate revenues, but they kind of all roll up into those 4. So if you've got something that works, why change it? But the issue is, it's only recently that sports have started to deploy technologies that enable them to compete with other verticals to capture and keep consumers and stakeholders. Because other verticals have been very quick to identify that, oh my gosh, we need technology, we need digital ad tech, we need digital media to be able to engage with our consumers. And sports are just now getting there. So I actually would say that there's like a couple of key trends that are driving this new business model for sports. And one of them is obviously digital media, because digital media provides a targeted advertising audience for brands. There's this entire ad tech stack that a brand, if you're Toyota, you're going to pay a CPM to get a specifically targeted audience, and you love that. You expect the same thing from your sponsorship in sports, but that doesn't exist. Consumer engagement, the ability to gather insights about your fans and their preferences, that's a technology ad stack. Access to cleansed and structured first-party data, essentially knowing exactly who your consumer is, that's a technology stack. And then, of course, in sports, there's athlete performance. Bottom line is, the better your players, the better the outcome. So it's been my experience that, like I said before, COVID, this understanding was already starting to take root and, kind of in those legacy sports properties, but it's really COVID that has driven that acceptance over the line.
Very keen points. So it's clear that you've learned a lot about, where the industry is and where it's going. Can you sort of give us a sense of your typical process of consultation? Meaning, what type of research is it that you're conducting when you're interacting with clients? Is it is it market research? Is it consumer journey and user experience type of work, competitor analysis? You referenced due diligence earlier, but where in your process do those types of things fit?
So that's a great question. And I work on both sides, right? I work with the sports properties and I work with the startup technologies. And they each have different questions with different answers. I mean, ultimately, the sports properties I help them identify their pain points, and then the technologies that I know that those deliverables solve for those pain points. But it's really two different sets of questions and diligence. So first, for the sports properties, when I work with a sports property, I actually need to help them understand why they're experiencing these pain points. And so, like, for instance, if a sports property doesn't know who their consumers are, it's likely because they don't have access to cleansed and structured first-party data. So this would mean that they need to deploy a technology that delivers fan engagement. Another scenario would be if a sports property can't sell out their arenas with their existing ticketing platform, it's likely that they're just not reaching a broad enough audience with a compelling price baseline. So this means that they need to engage with a dynamic ticket pricing technology that helps to solve this problem. And another scenario, particularly important right now, is if a sports team's athletes just aren't performing their best, or they're incurring like significant injuries, it's likely that they're not being properly monitored for load, nutrition, or biomechanic feedback. So this means that they need to engage with a performance technology that helps their athletes improve. So once I understand what the pain points for the sports property is and help the sports property understand the why, it makes it easier to advise a startup and connect the startup technology with the team. So the research that I do with the technology is a little bit different, and it's actually far more engaged. So I mentioned before, when I meet a startup, I always ask about the founder's story. I really want to know why they're solving this particular problem. And I have them walk me through a presentation. And, when a startup actually gets in front of an investor, they've got their investor deck. But a presentation is very similar to that. It's just kind of the first iteration. And the presentation always needs to have a couple of 6 or 7 slides that are absolutely critical. And it helps me understand where they are and where they need to go. So the presentation always needs the founder's story, needs to identify the problem, needs to identify the solution, their solution. They truly need to understand their competitive landscape. They need to show the tech and the product roadmap. They need to identify their business model. Are they a SaaS platform? What are they? They need to be able to generate the revenue projections based on what they think their wonderful tech is going to do. I need to see the team and advisors, and of course the anticipated exits. So if those core elements aren't in that original presentation, honestly, that group is not ready for consideration. You've got the research that is done for the sports properties to help them understand why they're having an issue. You have the research that is done with the technology companies to understand why they are solving the problem and why their solve is better. And then, honestly, in my own personal research, it's really important that I'm informed about technology trends, how they impact the sports ecosystem. And honestly, the only way that I can do this is through consistent, extensive research into the technologies themselves, understanding the problems that need to be addressed, and who is really solving for those problems. So I literally read sports and sports tech trade papers every day. I review TechCrunch every day to see what kind of companies are being funded or who's being acquired. I attend what is now virtual conferences, and I literally speak with my colleagues in sports and in tech and in the investor space to understand truly what's on their plates.
Wonderful. So it seems like there's a number of sources of hypotheses that can be sort of formed, and research questions that kind of bubble up to the surface throughout your work, and I can imagine that it's difficult to really narrow down that range of what the possible root cause is. So can you walk us through that process as far as, you show up, let's say, to with a sport organization, and they know that they have this problem with, connecting with their fans and fan engagement while they're in the stadium. Is there a process that you use to narrow down the range of possible culprits and decide on one that you think is the likely issue at hand?
So that's a really good question. And to give you an answer, as difficult as it is to get the jockey to be flexible for a startup, it's actually even more difficult to get the legacy sports properties to understand that they don't know what they don't know. And because these teams and leagues have been successfully doing what they've been doing for decades, and it's worked for them. Mm-hmm. They're winning games, they're generating revenue, they've got their sponsorship deals, like they've got it all going on. But getting them to understand that the world now operates differently than what they're used to is possibly the hardest thing, to overcome. And so when I do go in and I have a specific kind of task, which is if somebody comes to me and says, I'm just not getting consumers, then the research I have to do is ask them, so if you take a look at your CRM over the course of the last 5 years, okay, what does that look like? And what CRM product are you using? And who else has access to being able to get information into your database? And does your front office in the world of ticketing work with the back office in the world of, data gathering? So very often there will be these disconnects between different technologies that have been deployed for front office activity and back office activity. So it's not surprising that things get lost along the way. And so it's just literally, you've got to you've got to get the sports properties to focus on the why. You know, I don't know who my consumers are. I don't know who's sitting in my seats. Get them to understand the why. And then once you understand the why, it could be something as simple as, well, you know, I got 1 million likes on my Facebook page. I'm like, good for Facebook. You know, because Facebook knows who your consumers are, but you don't. So it's just getting to the why and then literally pulling down to how can we engage you in a technology that is going to literally help solve your problem. But it's honestly, it's rarely as simple as that, because there has to be buy-in at the team level or at the league level. Let's just say that it's, you know, somebody who runs sponsorship, and they're trying to find ways to be able to engage more sponsors. So knowing who their consumer is going to help them do that. But if it's a new technology that they have to bring in, how's it going to get paid for? Is it going to pass through legal? Is it going to pass through finance? And is it something that their brands are going to want? So it's never just a real simple, you know, it's not a simple answer, but that is how sports leagues work. So if you understand the layers of how a sports property works, at least you can help cut to the chase, and you can help deliver value for that person in sponsorship who's desperately trying to address, why don't I know who my consumer is? And you can help them tell that story all the way on up to the decision makers.
Wonderful. Yeah. You know, and a couple of things you said there kind of piqued my interest. You know, it's been said, and to some of the themes that you were just talking about sort of leads to the understanding that larger organizations, you know, franchises and leagues can be reticent to innovate. And like you said, because they've been doing what they're doing for a while, and they've been doing it well. So what's the incentive to change, or what's the incentive to innovate? Innovation is a research-driven process, right? That's why we equate R&D with innovation all the time. And so is the natural extension of that larger organizations are more research averse, perhaps, right? Because they have their own incentive structures. And so if they're doing research in-house on a particular technology or consumer relationship management strategy, and maybe the results don't come back in their favor, they see that as a threat to business. In your experience, is that an accurate understanding, or am I, you know, way off base there?
No, you're not way off base. And so just to kind of put it into perspective, so like I had said, you know, sports properties have been operating in this model that has worked for them. And that's because the two things that drive like that are at the top of the revenue funnel for sports properties are obviously rights holders deals and sponsorship. So when it comes to rights holders deals, I mean, even today, the TV deals that are being cut continue to increase. They're not decreasing, they're increasing. So if that core revenue driver continues to increase, then why does somebody need to change? Because that's working, and that's huge. But then as you start to look at the other areas of those kind of buckets, right? You've got the revenue streams, you've got the rights holders, you've got the sponsorship, you've got merchandise, you've got ticketing. So if you're a team or a property, and bringing this back to innovation, because this is kind of a real core issue, is that the business model isn't broken because the biggest revenue producer, which is still media rights, basically floats everything else. And if you're looking at if you're a team and you're putting together your annual budget, right? for the most part, your budget is based on the regular season. In the regular season, let's just say your assets and your liabilities and your P&L is zero at the end of the season. You don't have a profit, you don't have a loss. But you need to go into the postseason to generate profit. So for every game you get deeper into the postseason, you're going to generate a profit. And as long as that continues, that's great. But here's what's happening, which is forcing innovation. And one of the reasons I left sports was because after that whole digital evolution, I was like, oh my gosh, it's not sports that are innovative, it's the technology that drives them that's innovative. And I wanted to learn more about that. But when you get back to the business model, okay, and COVID is literally showing where the breaks in the business model are. The second largest revenue producer in sports is sponsorship. So if sponsors are brands, and I'm going to use Toyota as an example, okay, it used to be that Toyota wanted to own 100% of a sports property. They wanted every game, they wanted every consumer, and they didn't want another car company in there because they wanted exclusivity and they were willing to pay for it. Well, because they can target so much better on digital media through this advertising tech stack, they want from a sports team in their sponsorship what they get from digital media in advertising. And sports, because sports now no longer know who their consumers are, they can't deliver that value. So Toyota doesn't want to be an exclusive sponsor. They'll sponsor the, one area, and then the sports property will need to get a truck and they'll need to get a luxury car so that they can fill the car category. So this is an example of how things are changing, and sports is changing by default rather than by design. So all of the innovation that is being done in adjacent verticals now has to be adopted by sports because they recognize that the weak links in this existing business model are broken. And that is why they've got to depend on technologies to help them innovate so that they can get back to where they need to be.
Yeah, some really great points there. And just to elaborate a little bit and sort of flesh that out a little bit more, I keep thinking about, this tendency, I think, by most large organizations and perhaps sports organizations are more especially prone to this. This is not a particularly new phenomenon, right? If you go all the way back to the days of Bill James, who started the analytics revolution in baseball, he did so from outside of the MLB, right? He was not the MLB's friend because he's the one showing up saying, hey, I'm doing all this research and I'm running all these numbers and bringing together all these data sources, and you guys are kind of doing things wrong. Like, there's a more optimal way to play the game, and you should instead be doing X, Y, and Z. And they blackballed him, right? They chastised him for years and years, and a lot of his work didn't really get traction. Flash forward, 20, 25 years to Billy Beane and Moneyball, and ever since then, it's gotten to become a predominant part of the game. But you're absolutely right that there's a tendency to be reticent, right? If you operate within a structure where all you see is success all the time, driven by media and distribution rights that kind of even out inconsistencies in the rest of it. So so really, really great points there, and thanks for elaborating on that a little bit. So one of the other things I wanted to ask is, and you've mentioned this a couple times in our other conversations and in today, can you talk about first-party versus third-party data, what they are and how they differ, and where their value is, right? What's valuable about one versus the other?
Yeah, and this is like a little pet peeve of mine when it comes to sports. So obviously, first-party data is access to data points that you know are qualified and relevant. And for a person, that data point could be, you know, an email address, a valid email address, gender, you know, age range, geography. Those four are critical. And then, of course, if you can kind of have their income level, that's like a perfect scenario, because then you've got access to critical information that can be sliced and diced, and you know the quality is as good as you can get. Third-party data is data that you get that has been disintermediated, right? And I'll go through an example because I think that this will be relevant for everybody, but it could be a lookalike audience. It could be, trust me, my core audience is male 18 to 34 and they're early and they're affluent and this and that and the other, but you don't have the specific first-party data analytics to back that up. So I always say that first-party data is the currency of choice. And when you know who your consumers are, you can monetize them. And that's what a business model is all about. And that's true for any vertical. And so for sports specifically, this kind of goes back to what I was saying about the business model, but there's a then and then there's a now. So for sports, the then is like before digital media and technology partnerships, sports properties essentially had a one-to-one relationship with their fans and consumers. So people purchased their tickets and their merchandise directly from the team. Food and parking concessions were operated locally in alignment with the team. So the team had access to all of this first-party data, and they knew exactly who their fans and consumers were, and they shared that valuable target with brands who wanted to capture those fans through sponsorship. So in that case, the sponsor wanted and paid for exclusivity, like we were talking about before, because they knew exactly who they were targeting. And that's the power of cleansed, structured first-party data. When you know exactly who your consumer is, you can monetize them. So fast forward in today's landscape, sports properties can't access that critical mass of first-party data because they've essentially mortgaged that to their digital, social, and tech partners. So if you think about it, ticketing, concessions, e-commerce partnerships, social feeds, they get first access to that consumer. So as I think I said earlier, if a sports team gets 1 million likes on their Facebook post, good for Facebook, because Facebook knows who those consumers are, but the sports properties don't. And this, disintermediation is really third-party data. So you're delivering a lookalike audience which shares similar attributes to the first-party audience, but it's not the real thing. And third-party data isn't cleansed, it's not structured, and you can't ensure its quality. So when you look at it in the big picture, this lack of good data, it kind of cascades down. It negatively impacts the entire sports ecosystem. And when we're going back to that sponsor scenario, if a brand's no longer going to pay for sponsorship exclusivity just because they can't be assured of who they're targeting. It's like wasted money, right? It's a wasted media spend. And that means it's lost revenues for a team. So really, the ability to regain that first-party data is absolutely critical. And that's what fan engagement is all about. That's what, when I talk to sports properties about, and they're like, oh my gosh, I don't know who my fans are. I'm like, okay, well, let's figure out why, and then let's find the technologies that help you get there, because they do exist.
Yeah, wonderful. I think it's sort of, it can be summed up. There's this old saying, right, in statistics that, garbage in, garbage out. So if you bring in poor, low quality data, and you can build like very advanced, fancy statistical models on crappy data, and you're going to get crappy output, right? You're going to get uninformative output just the same. So, to your point, it's absolutely crucial to know who's there, who's in the stadium. And that's a very recent trend, right? Even up until 5 years ago, most stadiums were ticketed, physical ticket entry, and you walk in and you scan, but they don't know who that ticket is actually being held by, right? They know who they sold it to, but then, 3 sales down the line, 3 transfers down the line, they don't know who I am, right? The ticket might have been bought by, 58-year-old female living in Cleveland, but here I am visiting Cleveland for the weekend and feel like I want to go to a baseball game, and I am not that demographic. I'm very different, right? So you're absolutely right. Like, so transferring over and making a true effort to gather that first party data is important. You mentioned at the end that some of these technologies exist. Can you go into a little bit of detail as far as like what are some of these technologies, and how are they sort of shifting the landscape and helping drive the gathering of first party data?
So these technologies exist, and I would say there's probably about 4 or 5 that there's a. So going back to this concept of market adoption, right? The early technologies that helped sports properties connect with their consumers were actually technologies that were created for different industries, but were kind of repurposed and retrofitted for sports. So it was it was clunky, right? It wasn't smooth. So with sports tech, which is now becoming a thing, there's technologies that are created specifically for sports to help them address their pain points. So when you're looking at if a team is coming to me, or a property is coming to me, and they're like I have a CMO saying, oh my God, I have 17,000 people sitting in my arena and I only know who 3,000 of them are. Why is that? What can I do for that? So the technologies that deal most efficiently with that right now are literally, it's mobile, and they're apps that literally use bots to gamify an event that's happening in an arena. So let's just say you have 17,000 people sitting in an arena, and you've got something going up on the Jumbotron, and they're saying, okay, now we're going to play a game. Everybody log on to this app in arena and play along with us. And as they're playing the game, they're gamifying the app. If they want to win certain prizes, they're asked to put in their name, their email address, their general age, their gender, their location. And now that information then goes into the CRM of the team. They now have access to this consumer. They didn't know who they were before, but through the gamification of this app, they are obviously willingly giving this information so that they can be incentivized to win something, participate in something, and then the information that goes into the CRM is cleansed, it's structured, it's relevant, and it's quality. So there's a number of companies that do that now. And then as sports properties become more and more attuned to what works and what doesn't, you're going to see the technology start to change from literally what it is today, which is the gamification of apps, which basically helps a team access all of those anonymous fans that are out there, but they don't know who they are. Like there are all those Facebook fans that are out there, and then all of a sudden those are anonymous, but because they're gamifying these apps, that is turning into structured profile information. So that's kind of the most advanced technology that is out there, about 4 or 5 companies that are doing that. So it's out there. It's just, sports need to recognize technologies exist and, find ways to source them.
Yeah, that's a really great point. And you referenced sitting in the stadium, right, as part of a touch point for fans to provide data. But it occurs to me, right, that the amount of touch points that fans have with teams really exists in such a larger, never-ending ecosystem. The other day I was checking the score of the 49ers, which are they're my team, and so I was doing that on here. And so it strikes me that any sort of interaction that routes a touch point through a digital device can be a valuable source of data. And even in a stadium environment, right, anything, now that we're in a touchless environment, contactless environment, anything that shifts that touch point towards contactless, right? So virtual payments, anything like that. There's a couple of stadiums, I think, I know the Tropicana Field and a few others are moving towards touchless payments. So that means basically, Apple Pay or PayPal or, paying through the app that you referenced earlier. All of these can help tease out your consumer sentiment and behavior. And it's becoming so ubiquitous, but sneakily at the same time, it's kind of operating in the background. We don't always know what's happening, right? That we're providing these data. So can you, so we've got about, I'll say 10 minutes left. I'm curious if you can sort of bring this all together for us and walk us through, a case study where, you sort of parachuted into an organization that was experiencing some problems. And can you walk us through the research that you did to help them learn about their consumers or grow in some other way, shape, or form, and just sort of make this, this process really concrete?
So actually, yeah, it'd be my pleasure to. I'm actually going to go back in time for when I was working at the NHL, because I think it's actually very, very relevant to what's happening today. And also, in the end, it does show that just because you're a big kind of hulking company with some extreme infrastructure doesn't mean you can't change your ways. So this goes back to 2005. Some people may not have even been alive then, but the NHL, in 2004, 2005, the NHL endured its first lockout, where, during the collective bargaining agreement, obviously the players and the owners couldn't come to an agreement, so the season was canceled, which is actually very relevant to what's happening today with COVID, is that, all sports are facing, everything's stopped. There's no games, no sponsors, no TV partners, no revenues, nothing. So you need to reinvent yourself. And, the leagues who have been around at that time, the NHL was probably about, almost 90 years old, I think. They have a way of doing things. And I had kind of gone from growth, which was, growing 10 markets and 10 NHL, new markets over 10 years, into marketing. And we needed to come up with a very strong and distinctive and defensible platform to relaunch and re-engage with our sponsors and our stakeholders. We really needed to be a new breed of NHL. And this is not unlike, other leagues and other properties who have to take this time to become the next iteration of what they are or what they were. So we engaged in really significant research, and it was honestly the first time that we spent money on true research, that we weren't saying to a research company, tell us what we want to know. We were saying to researchers, tell us what we need to know. And I would joke, I would say, I don't want you to tell me what you think I want to hear. I want you to tell me if my core demographic is an 80-year-old woman sitting and knitting, I want to know that. Literally, tell me what I don't know. So there was this intense amount of research that went on, and post-research, The key attributes of our core demographics were pretty much what we expected. They were male. They were older than what we had hoped for. They were 30 to 55. They remained the most affluent of any league, but the defining attribute that we found out through this research were that they were early adopters of technology. So that was like our bingo moment. And remember, this is in the early 2000s, okay? So this was early days for digital media, and social hadn't yet started. But that was how we were going to reposition ourselves. We were going to become the digital league. So if you kind of liken that to a company that is either has to totally pivot, or they're coming into the market and they have to reposition themselves, we knew that we would become the digital league. And that meant that everything we did, every communication, every touch point had to start with NHL.com. So we had to prove our theory. And the way that we did that was when we launched, we went back to in 2005, 2006, we went back to season, and we launched our first promotion, which was NHL All-Star Fan Balloting. And this was engineered as a digital-only platform. So anybody who knows about All-Star Fan Balloting for any of the leagues, it used to be that it was printed ballots that were stuffed and tabulated in the actual arenas, which obviously limited who could participate to just people in the arenas, and it's usually a 6-week promotion. So we got rid of all of the print, all of the stuffed balloting and tabulation, and it became digital only. And we took NHL.com, we put the program in a number of languages, broadcast globally, and it was opened up to anybody in the world who wanted to vote beyond those 30 NHL markets. So after 6 weeks, we had our proof of concept. Typically, prior to this, the NHL would receive about 2 million All-Star paper ballots. So in the 2005 digital only, we received over 20 million digital ballots, which was just an enormous increase. But most importantly, we owned all that data because it came through our CRM at NHL.com. So that was the proof that the NHL needed, that they could become a tech-first sports leader. So I know that it's a long time ago, but it is kind of this classic, lesson that it doesn't matter how old you are, it doesn't matter how big you are, it doesn't matter how heavy infrastructure you are, if there's a commitment from the top to make a change, so innovate and to deliver innovation and distinguish you from your competitors, you can do it. It's just there has to be an alignment from the top to the bottom. And the bigger you are, the harder that is. But it absolutely can happen.
Absolutely. That's a really great example. That's a really concrete example that I think a lot of people can get behind, and perhaps some of the students may remember, or maybe they've read about. Just out of curiosity, the methodologist is just out of curiosity here, the methodologist in me is curious to know, if you wouldn't mind sharing, what was the light bulb moment for you, or what initiated that light bulb moment where these people are early adopters of technology? Was it a survey item, or was it behavioral, or how did you what shined through as like, this is a good proxy for early tech adoption?
So it was interesting because when a sports property, all right, kind of generates a survey, one of the reasons why they want to try to gather information is because they want to align their consumers with their sponsors, right? So one of the things that we were trying, because we didn't have, typically when you negotiate a collective bargaining agreement, at the end of the CBA, all of your agreements end. Your sponsorship agreements end, your rights holder agreements end, everything ends, so that there's kind of like no lag or overlap. So we understood that we were starting from ground zero, terrible term, forgive me for saying that, but we were starting from nothing. And we needed to identify for potential sponsors who those would be. And we couldn't fall back on, well, Coke used to be our sponsor, and this used to be our sponsor, and that used to be our sponsor, because they didn't exist in our world. So we needed to understand who our consumer was going to be so that we could then start to focus on sponsorship and who those sponsors would be. So not that I remember the specific questions, but to your point of methodology, you know, when we're getting to the likes and the habits and the behaviors of our core consumers, we wanted to understand, we knew that they were male, we knew that they were affluent, so we wanted to understand, how do you spend your money? And, you know, when they started saying things that were related to technology, things that were related to mobile phones, things that were related to the internet, things that were related to the next iteration beyond cable, you know, that showed us that they're going to spend their money on technology. They get this. And so understanding that helped us make that leap. Now, you know, again, it wasn't until we could confirm that All-Star fan balloting really was a better mousetrap digitally that we could confirm that we were on the right path. But we pretty much thought that, well, we couldn't do things the way we used to do them, because then we'd be getting, you know, little drips and drabs of value after all the other leagues got them. But once we were able to show that our core consumer really did engage in digital voting, they really did have access to all of this information, it made it a much easier value proposition for us to bring on a Verizon, or, you know, to bring on brands that were more in the technical space, more advanced than, you know, the Coca-Colas of the world. So it really did, that methodology in understanding who our core consumer was, what their behaviors were, that's really what made the difference.